Hi, I'm just some guy on the internet here with Esmeralda Zelda the Illuminated, or as we call her, the kitten. And today we're going to talk about systems leverage points and how we can use them to address and work on the ecological crisis, by which I mean like climate change, mass extinctions, soil loss, the complete and utter unsustainability of our food system, which is terrifying, water depletion, ocean dead zones, plastics pollution, the fact that our food system is making us sick, and a lot of scientists are even saying this is related to the problem of rise of infectious diseases like COVID. Now, before you jump in my comments getting angry about one of those things or one of these details, I'm going to argue about how we prioritize them, because we all love to argue about that. I'd like to just say that in a lot of cases, I feel those sorts of discussions are counterproductive when we all recognize that there's this big thicket, tangled mess of problems that we want to address, and we all agree that we want to move the world in a better direction and create a better world for all of us. And this is a great example of a systems leverage point and how we waste energy on things that are counterproductive instead of focusing on what will actually achieve our goals, which is the whole point of what I'd like to talk about. You see, Donella Meadows, the systems thinker, came up with this tool that we'll talk about for identifying which sorts of actions are effective and which are not. And what she said is that usually we have a tendency to focus on things that don't work. And in fact, in a lot of cases, we take actions that are counterproductive, add violence to the system, and actually make everything worse. Because as she said, complex systems don't necessarily react the way we think they will. They're not necessarily intuitive. We try to do one thing, and instead we get a different result than what we wanted. So the whole idea here is to, if we want to have meaningful change, we have to focus on things that are likely to actually move the whole complex system in a positive way. So here we have it. Donella Meadows' places to intervene in complex systems, and we're going to be talking about it again specifically for addressing the ecological crisis. As we can see here, Donella Meadows identified 12 actually different places we can intervene in the system, and later 13. But I've simplified this down to 4 main categories of actions for intervening in systems. These are what we could call brute force methods, which are measuring the numbers and trying to directly change them. Changing behaviors that drive those numbers. Changing systems, which means changing the systems that created the behaviors in the first place. And finally, what we could call deep change, which is changing the paradigms that created the systems. Or, best of all, transcending the paradigms altogether. And as we see here, down on the bottom left, this whole thing looks like a big lever for changing this complex system. And down in the bottom left, we have these brute force methods, directly measuring numbers and then trying to change them. And the thing is, we can think about this as being really easy to figure out how to reach up there and grab a hold of that lever. It's low-hanging fruit. So it tends to be where we focus all of our energy. For example, when we try to lose weight, the first thing we think of is just eat less junk food. We quantify how much junk food we're eating or calories, and we try to make there be less of that. The big problem with that is that when we're down here, it takes a lot of force, which tends to be interpreted as violence in some ways. You know, for one, if I am looking at a piece of cake over there and I know I'm not supposed to eat it, I'm going to interpret that resistance, not being able to eat my piece of cake, as a form of violence. Or looking at another problem, poverty. We'll focus in on poverty and say, well, the way to fix it is by taking the money from rich people and giving it to poor people. Well, the rich people are going to interpret that as violence. when we talk about, and this is why we tend to focus all of our energy, Meadows says, on these brute force methods. If it's our health, we think, well, we have to spend more time doing physical activity, even if we don't like that physical activity, perhaps. If we're talking about, frankly, all of these problems we're discussing, we have been trying brute force methods, measure the carbon, make the carbon go down, measure soil biodiversity, make the soil biodiversity go up, measure soil nutrients, make those go up. All of these problems, measure biodiversity, make the biodiversity go up. All of these things tend to create systems of violence and opposition to them. And worse, we just know that they tend to be ineffective. Look, we've been trying those methods for decades, and atmospheric carbon is going up. The poverty, we've had a war on poverty, and poverty isn't going down. In fact, global inequality is going up despite our war on poverty. How's the war on drugs working for you? So the thing about it is, as we move up, we can see that we're going to get more leverage if we can grab a hold of that lever up there. As we move up to one of these more powerful methods, they have more impact. The problem is they're really difficult to figure out how to get a hold of those levers up there. If only we could reach that lever, if we can make a complex systems change and switch to a completely different system, well, that's going to have a profound impact on the problem that we're trying to solve. The problem is, how do we do that? How do we get up there and grab a hold of that lever? The point of this is, these are easier to make big changes with, but they're a lot harder to figure out how we're going to intervene and make those changes. We got to think about them. We got to be clever and come up with a plan. Usually that means we're going to need friends down there who can help us out, and we're going to have to figure out some sort of method or strategy in order for getting up there. But when we do, even a small change can have a profound impact on the system. In Tibetan culture, there's an idea of Drala, which we could kind of see as like invisible, microscopic, angelic beings. And this is a great metaphor for this. It's what ended up becoming inspiring the Force in Star Wars. So we have to use the Force, Luke, if we want to change the complex systems. The idea with Drala is that they're kind of these little angelic beings who, with small amounts of energy, with the power of the butterfly wing, guide and direct human society and the world. And we can't see them, and we can't hear them or measure them, but if we're smart and we're sensitive, we can sense where the Drala is converging and where it's about to intervene. And at the right time and the right place, with just a single finger, we can move a mountain. That's the idea of deep change and of changing systems. It's looking for those leverage points where with small amounts of energy, we can have a big impact on the outcome of the system. So, going back to the beginning here, with brute force methods, measuring numbers and trying to directly change them, let's look at what kind of brute force methods we tend to use for the ecological crisis, because again, this is where we tend to focus. Now, for example, up on the top right, we could talk about measuring pollutants and cleaning them up. We can look at how much pollution there is and try to make that number go down. But if we're leaving, and this is the key insight, if we're leaving all of the whole big economic systems and industries and laws that enable pollution to continue to go up at an ever-increasing rate, we leave those big systems intact, then just cleaning up one isolated incident of pollution is not going to have a big impact. We're just going to get more and more pollution. Another example, and by the way, the industries that are doing the pollution are going to interpret those efforts as violence, because that's going to, they make money off of pollution. And so they're going to try to hire politicians and buy politicians to move that political football back the other way. And this is how brute force methods work. One side moves the political football down the field, and then the resistance to it builds up because of the violence with the brute force, and then the other side gets it and moves it back, and there we go, back and forth through the decades, never making any significant real progress. Another example of a brute force method for the ecological crisis that we focus on is like measuring the numbers of non-native species in ecosystems and directly trying to make those go down or completely eradicate them. Now, again, this takes violence. For example, we know that the whole ideology behind it is, call those species invaders, they're invasives. We have to use war rhetoric against them. And then we use war tools against them as well. Literally, the companies that make these poisons are the companies that made poisons and weapons during the world wars. And now we're turning those weapons of mass destruction against our own ecosystems, where we know they cause damage to native species too. And in fact, we know the whole thing doesn't work well. And in fact, the very first textbook on the subject of invasion biology, made by Mark Davis, calls for the end of the whole paradigm, because research has shown over decades it's simply ineffective. These brute force methods just don't work. He was involved with research on garlic mustard. And in fact, there have been about 6 teams that have done major studies and research on garlic mustard control. And garlic mustard's a major invasive. And what they found in every case, every researcher who studied this, is that when we try to take that numbers and make them go down with poisons and hand pulling and all of that, it actually causes the problem to be worse. The garlic mustard persists longer, spreads more, and the control methods cause more damage to native biodiversity than the garlic mustard did. So all of these teams of researchers now say that the best control method for garlic mustard is non-intervention, in which case it goes down on its own. And the truth, we're finding this with a lot of invasive species too. Another example is measuring atmospheric carbon and trying to directly lower it. We've been trying that for decades. It hasn't worked. Shaming people for having things like cats or daylilies because we consider those invasive species. Again, these are very tiny leverage points for real systems change, and yet we're guilting people, making them feel bad about being environmentalists, and then they end up hating the whole paradigm because they sense that it's a very poor leverage point for real change, and yet we're just guilting and shaming people about it. Shaming people for their individual carbon pollution makes no sense when we know it's about 100 corporations that drive almost all of the problem. And finally, measuring soil nutrients or biology when we're talking about agriculture to try to solve those problems and make it more sustainable. We just know we've been doing that for decades. It does not work. And in most cases, the whole paradigm causes soil degradation faster than if we don't do it at all. Okay, so a couple of things here. First, if we know that these things are ineffective and we go on for decades doing these things with no good results, why do we do them? Because the whole system is set up to focus on these sorts of things. For example, with politicians, if a politician is going to declare a war on poverty, that's easy for people to understand, taking money from rich people and giving it to poor people. A politician who focuses on changing complex systems, if it's difficult for people to understand, then there are going to be fewer people who try to vote for it. And then look at the whole scientific paradigm. Scientists end up being very siloed. They focus in on their one issue what do scientists do? They measure numbers, right? And so if a scientist is measuring numbers around things like the rise of invasive species, they're going to, or atmospheric carbon, they're going to focus in on that number as the problem and say, let's get this number down. So in fact, it's difficult for scientists, or maybe even unethical for scientists, to focus on anything else other than looking at the brute force of those numbers. So this is another reason why science is awesome and we need to use it and follow it, but to think that science will solve all of our problems and get us the world that we want is scientism. It's a religious faith in something, science, that isn't necessarily going to get us where we want to go. As we'll see, a lot of the things that have had the biggest impact on human society have been these higher leverage points that we'll look at next. And a second thing to remember here is that I'm not saying don't do the brute force methods. You see, some force in the right place is good. Remember with the Drala, you have to apply force with the right place at the right time to move that mountain. But it only takes a little bit of force if you get that right. So when we have all of these higher leverage points in place, then a little bit of force in the right place can make a big difference, as we'll see. Next up, as we move up in leverage, we come to changing behaviors. Now, which means changing the behaviors that drive the numbers. Now, a really important thing here is to understand this is not the normal way we think about changing behaviors. You see, a lot of times when it comes to changing behaviors, we think, well, we just need another study. We need more information. We need to win an election and get the word out or whatever, and that will change people's behaviors. This is how stuck we are in the idea of brute force methods. You see, there's a difference between real behavior change and brute force behavior change. We focus in on the idea of behavior change as a brute force thing. We measure the amount of studies we have and information and think if only we have more studies, more information, we can actually change people's minds. Yep, but think about that. With climate change, if we already have thousands of studies that are conclusive, that show that climate change is real and we need to address it, why do we think a few more studies will help? Like, instead, as the number of studies has been going up, the more people interpret that as political violence has been going up too. It's like we just need more studies to beat people with, and instead it hasn't worked. It's only made the opposition to it politically go up. And it's the same with almost all of these other brute force methods. See, we think that by changing people's minds, we can change their behaviors. But an abundance of research on behaviorism and changing minds and education has shown very definitively that almost never works. What does work is counterintuitive. You can't change people's behaviors by changing their minds. You change their minds by changing their behaviors first. Behavior is the leverage point. For example, up at the top left here, we have reduce, reuse, recycle. Now, there have been a few studies where researchers have actually tricked people into being environmentalists. For example, they do something that basically tricks them into recycling something. And when they do, they're exposed to a message that says that recycling is good for the planet. So then afterwards, they test people, and the people who were forced to recycle rated themselves as more environmentally conscientious than the people who were not forced to recycle anything. There's been a ton of studies like this, where when we change someone's behavior and get them to change their behavior even a little bit, it has profound changes on their minds and their beliefs. So we're talking about trying to do things that change behaviors directly. Permaculture is great for this. Wow, here's why we're talking about things like herb spirals, because we're telling people this is an easier way to garden. And then at the same time, we're telling them by doing this, you're caring for the earth, caring for people, and caring for fair share. Then they make the herb spiral because they want an easier garden, and boom, suddenly they care about the earth and care about people. So this is one of the key strategies involved in permaculture. And some other things that go along with this could be not spraying. So we have our holistic natural methods of gardening. And apparently Pedro has a lot to say about this too in the background. Change lawn mowing. The lawn mowing behavior. You know, so many people are out there mowing their lawns. We can change that behavior. Just get people to mow less often. It can have a big impact. And let them know the reason to do it is because it helps the planet. Well, of course, they can also waste less of their time mowing the lawn. And have a more beautiful yard too. Avoiding plastics. Instead of using concrete, which is like the third largest driver of climate change, we can get people to use recycled concrete. These don't change the whole system. They just change small aspects of behavior within our current system. Getting people to buy local and regenerative food instead of buying corporate industrial produce. Investing in less destructive stocks, for example. This could be another thing that we could do. All of these ways change behaviors, and now we're getting to leverage points that we know and have research will actually improve our outcomes. Moving up from there, next we have changing systems. This means looking at and evaluating the whole system that is creating the problem in the first place. So when we look at poverty, for example, we might want to think about changing our whole system of sort of socialized capitalism, where we have the government imposing corporations and corporate ownership of everything on people. And meanwhile, we're all wasting our energy fighting over the difference between socialism and capitalism. When we have this weird combination of both, where it's literally the same people who own the corporations who are the people who run our government, imposing their ownership of everything on us. So when it comes to dealing with invasive species, we have great research-based paradigms on this too, called priorities-based management. So we can switch from this idea of just measuring numbers of invasive species and fighting them to thinking about creating a whole system that will be better off for the planet. My books are based on this idea and have a lot of information about this research-based best practice that's being pushed by the world's leading research ecologists and managers. We could ditch industrial agriculture. Let's focus in on the systems driving the problems. What is the number one cause of climate change? What is the number one cause of mass extinction? What is the number one cause of habitat loss globally? What's the number one cause of biodiversity loss? What's the number one cause of ocean dead zones? What's the number one fastest growing rise of plastics pollution? Industrial agriculture is the answer for all of these. If we ditched industrial agriculture, the spray and tillage paradigm behind it, we would change all of these systems overnight. We would solve all of these problems overnight. Ditching car travel for public transportation would be a powerful leverage point. Ditch industrial landscape management. The idea of having lawns and spraying them and having industrial concrete pavers and all of that. Let's ditch all of that, and we would have a huge, profound impact on all of our problems. Moving up from there, what's one of the world's most destructive industries? Clothing. Change the systems that we use to make and provide clothing, and we'll have a huge impact on all of these problems together. Now, again, these can be harder to figure out how to change. But if we do, we get dramatic impacts and changes overnight. Now, one of the big problems with these is in a lot of cases, to try to change systems, we have to look for even better leverage points. Which brings us to the idea of deep change, deep changes. Now, this means changing the whole paradigms that drive the systems and create these systems by themselves. This means we all run around with the ideas in our minds that create the self-organizing systems of behaviors that are driving all of these. For example, the paradigm of the lawn is so powerful, and that people think they need that lawn to show that their yards are neat and that they're tidy, and the real estate value is associated with it. And we have laws that back it up and all of this. So changing this paradigm that we need lawn instead, and changing it to the idea that we have beautiful, abundant home paradises. Boy, that's the name of one of my books. Changing that paradigm will help change that whole system of industrial lawn management. From there, we'll have a completely different system for how we change that drives the behaviors. Then we won't have people having that behavior of mowing the lawn. Moving up from there, transforming people's view of success. A lot of our problems are driven by the idea that we perpetuate systems because we want to be successful. So we go to work and invest in the very corporations that we know are causing all of the problems that we care about the most. Redefining wealth so that we're not chasing after a brute force idea of wealth, which is numbers in a bank account, and instead thinking about wealth as a beautiful, supportive system that makes our lives healthy and rich and gives us free time and puts us in touch with nature and community and gives us things that make life feel rich without having that number in a bank account. Transforming our relationship with food so that we don't think of food as just a tchotchke that we buy at the store with money. Again, it's brute force. And instead, think of food as the energy that we share with an ecosystem. Food is not just, in fact, a lot of traditional societies didn't even have a word like food. Food is an industrial concept. Instead, they had the types of food that were actually associated with ecosystems and living beings. Our food is a relationship with living beings. We don't have food. Food is a myth. There's only living beings that we have a relationship with. We can transform our relationship with nature by, instead of thinking ourselves as up here above nature, we can rejoin nature as just one part of a complex system of life, and that nature, our animals and plants are our elder relatives who've been here longer than us that we can learn from. And as we move up even further, we can learn to transcend these whole paradigms that are driving the system. We can show people a whole new, beautiful, deeply meaningful way of living. And we can transcend consumption altogether and instead just have relationship. And if we get this idea of showing people how we can build much more beautiful communities, more beautiful, rich, meaningful ways of life and of being in the world, we won't have to twist people's arms with brute force to change these problems. People will line up for the change like it's the new iPhone.